Yeah, I think the world is just separating into winners and losers. And if you think about history, it's always been that way, right? There are people who believe that the future is bright, that there are things within their control that they can do to help not only create that better future, but also to capture value along the way. They understand usually some sort of free market incentive system. They realize that wealth is generated by solving problems for people. And they have a motivation to not only be ambitious, but also the courage to act.
Thanks for coming on, man. Good to see you again.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, totally. So I'm going to ask you the same question you asked me on Monday, but Uno reverse it for you. World is changing, lots of things happening, culturally, politically, business, exciting times with Bitcoin. Where do you see the vibe shift happening? What's changing in your world that you're excited about?
Yeah, I think the world is just separating into winners and losers. And if you think about history, it's always been that way, right? There are people who believe that the future is bright, that there are things within their control that they can do to help not only create that better future, but also to capture value along the way. They understand usually some sort of free market incentive system. They realize that wealth is generated by solving problems for people. And they have a motivation to not only be ambitious, but also the courage to act. And so that tends to create a group of people who in today's society seems to actually be quieter and kind of more in hiding than the other group. The other group is people who complain, who say, hey, the future is not bright. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm screwed. You're screwing me. And so I'm in a really bad situation. It's not going to get better. There's nothing I can do. And it's, frankly, a pretty depressing, dire outlook on life today, but also on the future. And so I always kind of put this into a very simple sentence. It's the future is going to be determined by those who learn to compete, not complain. And if you can just get that, and use that as a mantra or kind of a motto of, hey, today when I'm facing a problem, am I competing or am I complaining? And that will be what really divides, I think, the outcomes for folks. And so it doesn't have to be winners versus losers. It's just that's where, it's kind of happening. And actually, I think the winners want to pull as many people along with them as possible. It's very much a positive sum, not a zero-sum game. It's just, you can't help people who don't want to be helped.
Yeah, that's where do you think the opportunity is right now for those people, for those high agency people who are willing to be competitive and take responsibility and go for it? What areas broadly do you think best fit those folks right now?
Yeah, I think that there is kind of a barbell, approach that you can take to looking at this. On one hand, there are things that are incredibly new, incredibly innovative, incredibly risky, and take an immense amount of courage, coordination, resources, and frankly, craziness, right? I'm an investor in a company called Varda. They created the world's first space manufacturing facility. And if you said to somebody 5 or 10 years ago, like, hey, we're going to basically create something, we're going to throw it up in space, and it's going to manufacture drugs, and then we're going to bring them back down to Earth. That sounds insane. Like you have to be crazy to actually think that that's true, right? And so that is kind of the tip of the spear of innovation, and that whole sector of work is where I think a lot of people get excited about, venture capital and kind of the future of both our society, but also economies and societies around the world. On the other end of that barbell is what I'll call old world opportunities, and so there's a ton of opportunity in blue collar industries, manufacturing, industrial, et cetera. Sometimes these two things intersect. There's many companies that I think you all and I are very aware of, some of them that we've each invested in, that are trying to take kind of that new world tip of the spear innovation and apply it to that old world. But that doesn't mean that you have to be, kind of Silicon Valley gung-ho innovation to go and have a lot of success in these industries. There are plenty of people who have built incredible lives for themselves, both in terms of financial freedom, but also impact on their local communities and employees by simply just running a really good business that does a thing that everyone in the community needs. Right. And so that could be a restaurant, that could be, the classic HVAC business, or it could be something that is kind of nuanced and you're able to bring it to multiple markets. But that barbell becomes really interesting because part of that analysis or the most important part of that analysis is what's not included in the barbell. And so where I don't think there's a lot of opportunity is in your kind of, second, third, fifth, 10th, 40th iteration of some B2B software. Yes, there will be some winners, but from a probability standpoint, it actually is not going to be nearly as high as the people who choose one of the extremes of the barbell.
Mhm.
And so when you see that, a big reason for it is because capital is going to chase high innovation, tip of the spear, power law outcome. It's either a 1 or a 0, and it's a rocket ship or it's a crater in the earth, or they're going to go to spreadsheets and they're going to say, okay, I can get 20% compounded annual growth by simply continuing to invest in a business that is able to optimize cash flow and acquire for growth and do things in kind of that old school traditional PE style model. The people I don't see really getting a lot of capital flowing to them are going to be the people who are building things that are uninspiring and don't have a clear business model or a clear path to success. And so I'm a big believer that the market you choose is more important than the asset you choose in investing. I think the same thing when you invest your time is the type of business that you go work on is almost more important than the actual business. And so choosing barbell instead of kind of that dead man zone in the middle, I think will be really important for people.
Mm-hmm. Some people might say that those two ends of the barbell are in conflict, kind of from a macro history perspective. If you say, maybe especially in the Bitcoin space, you have people in the Balaji camp or others who say the world's de-dollarizing, American hegemony is waning, it's time to invest in disruptive alternative spaces, versus maybe more of like a Warren Buffett perspective of like, America is going to be around for the next 100 years. It's going to be powerful for the next 100 years.
Never bet against America.
Never bet against America. Just keep on pumping into those boring businesses, hitting 20% a year, and you're going to be set. Do you see a conflict between those two kind of trajectories, or is there a compatible synthesis?
Yeah, look, it's a big world, right? And they're both true. If you look at it on a country basis, there's definitely de-dollarization going on, right? There's countries who are buying less treasuries. There are countries who are becoming more worried about sanctions or, not being the United States' friend in the future. There are countries who definitely see risk with the US dollar system being kind of the global reserve system. And so they want to hedge their bets. All of that's happening. But if you go and you look at what individuals are doing, 48% of all international transactions, dollars are being used. And so it's by far the largest currency, and that's increasing. That's not decreasing. And so when you see that, then you layer in things like stable coins. The US dollar stablecoin market has exploded in popularity. People want dollars to transact, right? And so at the same time, both things are true. There's a de-dollarization that's happening on the kind of a geopolitical level, but there's actually a dollar adoption that's happening on an individual level. And so being able to separate out those two things, I think is important. It's hard. You got to spend a lot of time looking at the data. You got to really understand the nuance. You got to talk to people in these markets. So it doesn't play well on Twitter to talk about nuance. Like, it's much easier to just pick one of the two camps and, fire off your memes and shit posting. But the nuance is there and trying to understand it. If you take that same, kind of healthy conflict around dollars and then you bring it to these markets, like, people make money a lot of different ways, right? One of my favorite things is whenever I hear about a business and you're just like, wait, that's a business? There's a guy yesterday I was talking to, and his entire business, he does 8 figures in revenue. His entire business is he goes to companies and he says, whenever you are rotating all of your technical equipment, so your computers, your servers, all this stuff, we come and we'll pick it up for you. And we'll pay you a little bit of money so you can recoup a little bit of cost. And then basically all he's trying to do is he's trying to get the laptops, and the laptops get refurbished or repurposed. And then he's able to sell those and make money. And so literally he took a quote unquote trash business. I'll pay you for your trash. And he's able to figure out an entire business model around it. And you look at it, you're like, man, that's awesome. Right. I didn't even know that was a business, but like, that guy has built an incredible thing. It's profitable. He's been able to provide for his family and a bunch of employees and stuff like that. And so when you see that happening, again, there's a healthy tension. On one hand, it's like one man's trash. On the other hand, it's like literally the feedstock to a guy's entire, company and all of his revenue and profit. And so I think that those healthy tensions exist all throughout society. And so when you see the narratives, I always ask myself, like, if this is true, what else is true? Or like, what is the opposite and how true is that? And so a lot of times what you'll find is just like the tension exists. And if you go find both groups of people, they're both willing to tell you their side of the story. but really both of them end up being true. And Bitcoin, gold, all these things I think follow the same thing.
Yeah. A quick note earlier, you mentioned Varda. We had Delian on the pod. So people, if you haven't listened to, if you don't know who what Varda is or who Delian is, you should definitely follow him on Twitter. Great guy. And listen to the pod. They just got their approval last night to come back to get the entry capsule back to Earth, which is super, super cool.
Yeah. I mean, look, that's like a perfect example. Also, this healthy tension, right? On one hand, it's like, an entrepreneur built a team, raised capital, and built a business here in the United States. And they did something that no one else in history has ever done. In all of human history, no one has ever created a manufacturing facility that can go up to space, manufacture drugs, and bring them back. And for months, regulators would not let them come back, right? Now, on one hand, you're like, this is insane. So what did Varda do? Like any great entrepreneur, they went and they said, hey, yo, Australia, if we launch from you guys, can we bring it back there? And they were like, yeah, of course. And so incentives, capitalism plays a part, right? So on one hand, you're like, man, America is shooting themselves in the foot. Why won't we let these people bring this back? Why are we pushing people offshore? Why are we doing all this? On the other hand, there's this like regulatory first approach of like, I don't know, maybe we don't want things like flying through the atmosphere just randomly. Varda seems like they are responsible people and they know what they're doing and like they're not going to do anything that's going to endanger people. But like, I don't want to live in a city where all of a sudden there's just things falling from the sky because some random, Joe Blow decided that he could just bring shit back into the atmosphere. And so again, there's a healthy tension there. But I think that understanding who are we dealing with? We're not dealing with a nefarious actor. We're not dealing with someone who doesn't have an entire kind of structure and system and safety plan and all these things in place. We should give those people much more leeway because they're quote unquote serious compared to the person who's just going to go do like a weekend science project and if it works, great, but if not, and somebody gets hurt, who cares? I think that treating everyone with one broad brush is dangerous to do, and Varda's a great example as to why.
Yeah. So you talk about there's a lot of different ways to make money. How do you like to make money, Pomp?
A lot of different ways. No, look, I think that, the reason why I have that barbell framework in my mind is because it's very similar to what I follow, right? And so I would really put a number of our activities. So there's a lot of investing that we do. From an investing standpoint, I am not very participatory in the public markets. There's a whole bunch of reasons why we can talk about that. I do a lot of early stage private investing. I do a lot of crypto investing. And then I do a little bit of commercial real estate investing. Mm-hmm. And if you think about that investment bucket, it is very high risk, very potentially asymmetric, and very much focused on like 5 to 10 plus years out is when you will know whether it's working or it's not. And so that is illiquid, high risk, kind of everything that probably your financial advisor would tell you not to go do is the bulk of all of my wealth and investing. On the other hand, we build a bunch of companies, and those companies tend to be things that are not moonshot ideas. They are not, let's go raise $500 million and try to go do something that has a 0.1% likelihood of working. These things, sometimes they're technology related, sometimes they're media related, sometimes they're old world, kind of manufacturing related. But really they are focused on like, how do you build a solid business that is profitable within the first 6 months, that is able to be a sustainable business that you don't have to worry about like, am I going to burn a bunch of cash here and it's not going to work, right? And so a lot of my friends who are some of the most ambitious people in the world, or some of the craziest people when it comes to this stuff, they're like, Pomp, why are you wasting your time doing these things that seem unambitious or seem small? And it's because it's part of the barbell. So if you look at it on a totality basis, like I'm pretty sure that the investment portfolio, most people would throw up at the volatility and, all the things that happen there. And so I balance it out by having these things that are much more kind of predictable, kind of cash flow driven. And so I've just tried to follow, how I see the world evolving. It's like, I want a foot in both of those. And what I found is that insights from either one will reinforce the other. Right. And so the more that you can be kind of well-rounded in your understanding of these two different extremes, I think the better off you are at making decisions in either one of them.
You found that those inform one another in terms of the boring traditional businesses, lessons you learn there apply on the other side and vice versa.
Yeah. Like there's a specific example of a business right now that we're buying into that I don't want to give. So let me try to. I don't want to tip people off yet to our thesis, but let me try to give a good example. So let's say, for example, humanoid robots are going to be this thing that everyone's trying to do. So Tesla's got a version of this. There's a company in Austin called Figure. There's a couple others that are trying to do it. Boston Dynamics for a long time had like the dogs and all this stuff, right? So we have a birth rate problem, which is we need to have more kids in order to replace the population so that we can continue to grow and be productive and drive GDP growth. It's not happening. So what's going to occur is we're going to have to replace a lot of those people and the jobs that they would have been doing with robots and automation. And so you can almost look at it like as an investor, most people would just look at demographics and they'd be like, oh, Nigeria, really young population, big, growing fast. Like they're going to have a bright future. Japan, old, not growing that fast. They're not going to have a bright future. And that was like the investment thesis for a lot of people, right? We just look at the demographics of a country and allocate capital accordingly. Well, now all of a sudden, you can't just look at human demographics. You have to be able to look at robotics as well. And so a very big input is going to be, well, how many robots are they manufacturing or employing in their economy? Because you could have Japan become the most automated robotic, kind of workforce in the country, in the world. And it doesn't matter what their human demographics are, because they actually get more productivity out of the robot that works 24/7, 365 than you would out of a human taking that job. And so now you have to look at both demographics and robotics. Now, why do I bring that up? Well, there's going to be a bunch of things that end up getting created in an old world model that if you understand the rise of robotics is going to happen, that you can go and you can take a look at this. And so if you look at a direct example, there's a business, I'm not an investor, I wish I was, called Senra Systems. They build electronic or electric like harnesses. And if you think of all the space and all the manufacturing, all these things that are happening, right? They need these harnesses. But that sounds like a super old, boring, kind of not modern, cool business. But they understand, oh my God, all these businesses need this one piece of hardware and this connectivity inside of their systems. But all of the legacy players don't understand the new specifications. They're slow. They can't rapidly iterate with these customers. And so there's a mismatch. I think of it as like a CD-ROM trying to get put into a cassette tape player. Right? The technologies, the types of businesses, the speed at which they operate, the way they communicate, all these things don't work. And so there's an entrepreneur who said, well, I'm going to go build an old school business around these electric harnesses. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to build it specifically to serve these new school customers. And so I think you're going to see a lot of that, but it takes an entrepreneur who understands the new world and the kind of innovation that's happening and the progress. And then an understanding of how does that old world work? Where are the deficiencies and where are the opportunities? And you put those things together, and I think a lot of value can get created.
What did you think you were going to do growing up, Pomp? Did you see yourself doing this, what you're doing right now, or something else?
I notoriously never had a long-term plan. I think I've talked about this before on the podcast, but I didn't even think I was going to live to 35. Like I used to tell people like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like, I don't know. I got to get done by 35 though. Cause like, I'm definitely not making it to that. And part of it was like, I don't know, like it was a weird question. I didn't want to answer it. So I was kind of like self-deprecating just to be able to get some sort of answer out there. But also I think that there was an element of, I was doing a lot of crazy stuff as a kid, right? I was in the Army. I at one point I had a motorcycle and be driving like a maniac on that. I'd partied a lot, did all these things. And so, it was always like, what does the next like 1 to 2 years look like? Not what's the next like 15 years. And the one thing that in hindsight, I always embodied that served as a great tailwind for my career was I was never married from a identity standpoint to a job, a career, a corporation or an opportunity. And what that allowed me to do is if I was working on something and I became uninspired or didn't enjoy it, I could very quickly just switch to go do something else that I enjoyed. And so I was able to iterate myself to understanding I wanted to sit at the intersection of business and investing. And I wanted to be what I call like a ball player, right? And so if you think of like Little League baseball, most people are generalists. It's not until later on in baseball do you become a specialist. You're only the pitcher or you're only the catcher or you're the designated hitter or you're the center fielder. When you're a kid, you're 12, right? They're like, hey, get out there, like go play shortstop. Okay, next inning, like literally the next inning. Okay, you're the first baseman now, like change your glove, right? And like, oh, hey, the pitcher, he sucks. Like, let's switch. And if you go to Little League baseball, you may literally see the first baseman or the shortstop become the pitcher in the same inning. And so that whole idea of like, you want a ball player, someone who can just get thrown in any position and be successful, I think is something that I decided, okay, after studying tons of entrepreneurs and tons of investors over the years, the best ones, the people who created the most value, solved the most problems, and had the greatest impact on society, they were ball players. And obviously, the Elon Musks of the world, et cetera, I think people point to today. But if you just go to a local town and you say, hey, who are the most successful people in this town? Most of them will have built multiple businesses in different industries. They'll be involved in real estate. They'll do private investing, and they'll have a stock portfolio. Like, that's a ball player, right? You're operating, you're investing across asset classes, across industries, and to be able to do that for a long period of time and be successful takes someone who's got a kind of varied skill set. And so that's kind of what I aspire to continue to hone.
That's awesome. A unique thing about you, though, is you took advantage of the reach of something like YouTube in ways that maybe some of the entrepreneurs that you and us would study just didn't have. Like, it was just a different world even 20 years ago. So did you willingly go into YouTube and content creating and podcasting, knowing that it could be a lever to accelerate this direction of your career? And how has it changed since you first started?
Yeah. When I worked at Facebook, I ran the growth team for Facebook pages. The whole idea was like, get more small businesses onto the page ecosystem. And really that was like the top of the funnel for advertising on Facebook. And so I happened to work there at a time where people hadn't really worked on it before. We had a ton of success. After a while of working on that, I had the opportunity to go work directly with Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg on a very small team. And the whole idea was they wanted to build their audience on Facebook. And that sounds crazy today, but back in 2014, kind of early 2015,
like their personal audience?
Their personal audience. And really what they understood but didn't articulate in this way was go direct. They wanted to talk directly to their users. And at the time, I think Facebook had like 1.5 billion users on the platform. And Zuck had like 9 million followers on Facebook. And so he can't talk to majority of the users on Facebook, right? And so part of this effort was you can like manipulate the product. You could, MySpace Tom, everyone becomes his friend. You could like put an interstitial over the website and like message from Mark Zuckerberg. We consider doing all of those. Like, we got very close multiple times to doing some of that stuff. And one of the beauties was there was people in the room. Like, I remember there was one guy who at one point was my boss and has been a great mentor and a friend to me, named Jonathan Geller. And he's like, guys, listen, I don't want to break up the meeting, but like, I come from a country, Venezuela, where like the state takes over the media channels because they're dictators, right? Like, they interrupt the 8 p.m. programming and they're like, hey,
it's like, I've seen this one.
I am the president.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so like in the United States, where we might just like, we're all stupid Americans. We just like click out of the interstitial. We don't care. We just move on. Like, in other countries, the cultural reaction to it may be different. And so like having the right people in the room and understanding different cultures and stuff like that's really important. But long story short is they didn't want to manipulate the product to their credit. And they said, hey, we got to go learn to do this. And so that was really a crash course for me. If Zuck's face is in the photo or not, is there a certain message that resonates, all this kind of stuff. And so really trying to understand, how do you build the audiences? And so through that work, I began to meet a lot of brands who were coming inbound to Facebook. Actually, one of my favorite ones and one of the first ones was the Instagram account Fuck Jerry. Those guys were big on Instagram. They were trying to figure out Facebook because the Facebook team kept yelling at them, like, get on Facebook. And so I met them and was trying to help them figure out how do you take the memes and like get them onto Facebook and grow your audience. And so it just became obvious, like, hey, I've helped all these other people. And so in 2017, I had, I think, 2,000 followers on Twitter. I had no other platforms, but I knew audience is going to be currency in the future. Like, having a big audience is going to be a thing. And it wasn't new. Like, if you had a TV show 20 years ago, like, you had influence, you had opportunity. If you were a movie star, right? Like, whatever. But now, like, the TV station is in your pocket, right? And you can just go and do that. And so I did make a concentrated effort, but I didn't know what I was going to do with it, right? It was just kind of like, hey, let's just build an audience in some weird way. And the only way I knew how, like, I'm almost like my brain's too small. I had to simply say to myself, I'm just going to say the truth, right? Like I don't have a team. I don't have anything else. Like, I'm just going to say what I believe and like, let's see what happens. And I'll actually never forget. I don't even know if he knows this story. I've been doing this for like months and months and months and months. And like, a bunch of my friends were like, hey, like chill out over there. Like you got hot take after hot take going on, that you're just like firing out into the ether. And I was like, they're not hot takes. Like I actually believe some of this stuff. And then one day Keith for a Boy went through, and I'll never forget this. I was driving and I looked down at my phone and all of a sudden I had I think 100 notifications from Keith for a Boy. He had gone through my Twitter account. Every single tweet he had gone and liked. And then after 100 of them, he says, great Twitter account, or replied to some random one. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I think that's awesome. Actually how Keith and I originally met. Was he tweet bombed me with a bunch of notifications. And so it was all right, this obviously resonates with some group of people. It's probably the group of people that I want it to resonate with more than not. And so I just keep doing it. Now, what's changed is now everyone is trying to do this. And there's two groups of people. Again, separation into winners and losers. The winners are the people who say the truth and are authentic and just simply do the things that they would do behind closed doors. The losers are the people who do all the inauthentic things where you're literally, you see them create content, you're you're a loser.
Right.
And nobody wants to talk about that, right? Because everyone wants to be supportive on the internet and oh, good job, Johnny, whatever. No, you're a loser. You're literally creating inauthentic content. And if I was, going to high school with you, I'd be you're a loser. Right. And so if you think about it from that perspective, it's don't be a loser, be a winner. How do you be a winner? Just be yourself. Do the same thing that you would do behind closed doors. And I think that it has to come from a place of genuine interest and curiosity. And a non-commercial effort. Right. Whereas now what you see a lot of times is people are they have the end game in mind. They work backwards and they say, okay, in 6 months, I'm going to launch this thing. Let me start now. And they start creating content. And at first you can't tell, is it inauthentic or is it authentic? But very quickly you realize oh, come on. This is just something's coming, right? Like something is on the horizon. And so I think that it is, because more competition, more people want to game it. But what I've found is there is no game that you can really play that will win. You just have to have good content. Nothing is better than just having good content. And that will be, 90% of all of the value of trying to grow an audience. It's just providing people the value of when they open their app, they see your stuff, they want to consume it regardless of what the format is.
Yeah, that's great. What's funny is this meeting, you and I we met precisely through the same mechanisms, just Twitter and content and seeing each other's stuff, and eventually wanting to connect and seeing what's up, what's going on.
I can only count probably less than 10 people in the last 3-4 years that I've met in real life that is a friend, right? Most of my friends I met online and then we became friends in real life. And so when you think of it that way, there's all these studies now that are coming out oh, people are spending 30% less time hanging out with each other and all this stuff, whatever. But it's kind of I don't need new friends. I don't want new friends, right? I'm at a point in my life where I want to spend time with my family and everyone else just leave me the fuck alone. And so if you think of it from that perspective, those friends, I'm going outbound, I'm selecting them. Right. And so it's very much I've seen them creating content or talking about things or there's some reason why I'm hey, I want to talk to you. It's not oh, I went to a bar and some random dude showed up next to me and man, that guy can chug beers fast. Let's do it again next Friday.
Yeah.
Right. I'm right. Past that point of my life. And so I do think that the internet, although it seems a little bit less, personal, it allows for a higher quality of selection, which actually will lead to tighter bonds and longer relationships because the hit rate is so high when you make those connections online because you have more information to actually make the decision.
Yeah, I think that's true. And people who say, there's a lot of people who say, maybe they have a secondhand sort of opinion about Twitter, let's say, but they'll think of Twitter as just a cesspool. You go there to fight, or maybe they are active on Twitter and they're this just pointless fights, whatever. I always tell those people, if you're having a bad time on something like Twitter, you're just doing it wrong. You're absolutely doing it wrong, and you're leaving an insane amount of value on the table. Where that if you do it right, you can just you can create so much value for yourself, for your business, for whatever it is that you want to do, just by doing it correctly.
When I was in high school, my father used to always tell me, don't compare yourself to the bottom of the rankings. right? Because I would always tell him like, oh, I got, a C. And he'd be like, yeah, but somebody in the class got an A, right? I'm like, yeah, but I'm passing. And he's like, yeah, but somebody else got an A. Like compare yourself to the best, not the
anchor
worst.
to the top.
Yeah. And so it goes back to like winners and losers, right? Like if you hang out with a lot of losers, you become a loser. If you hang out with winners, you become a winner. Same thing is true online. If you find yourself in that cesspool, like you got to eject yourself and you got to get into the winner pool, right? And that could seriously, I mean, like it sounds crazy. That could be unfollow every single person you follow today and rebuild, like zero-based budgeting for followers, right? And start all over again and start with the highest quality accounts that you can find. And then just be ruthless with who you allow into that timeline. And you're training an algorithm to give you the right type of content. Again, we live in a society that is just absolutely overrun with thoughtfulness, where people they don't care. They don't think. They're not intentional. There's no critical thought into actions. And so what do? You're just like scrolling and you just keep following random accounts. Like, oh, this one's got cool puppies. This one's got, cool TikTok dances. This one's got whatever. And next thing you know, you're like, oh, I'm programming my brain of garbage in, garbage out. Right. Yeah. Versus I know some friends, I won't mention one of them, but he'll laugh if he hears this. He will text me. It's like his proudest professional achievement is he has trained his Instagram algorithm to only send him clips of like interviews of like savage business or investing legends. Right. And he'll like send them to me all the time. And he's like, I've trained the algorithm. Like the algorithm works for me now. Right. And again, that's the extreme. But like, guess what? If you hang out in the cesspool or you hang out with that guy, right, there's very divergent outcomes that come from that. And so it's just trying to constantly improve, level up, and be intentional, I think will treat people right. And to your point, like that's quote unquote doing it right versus kind of the mindlessness that is also available on the same platform.
What's maybe one or two of the most sort of unexpected things that places people that you met through this strategy?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily just because of the strategy. A lot of the coolest or craziest things have been, doing stuff online led to meeting someone, which introduced me to someone, which led to like an experience, right? So it wasn't necessarily directly there. But there are individuals that I have met that, 10 years ago, I was like, oh my God, I would love to learn from that person and, read everything they wrote and all of that. Sometimes it goes well, sometimes it doesn't. Like that's the other thing, right? So, I don't want to, there's one day, I'd built an asset management firm with two other guys, a guy named Mark Yusko and a guy, Jason Williams. Mark previously was the CIO at UNC Endowment, and he had built a company called Morgan Creek Capital Management, very successful asset management firm. And he was very close with, because he had been an LP in many Wall Street legends, hedge funds or kind of asset management firms. And so he knew these guys personally for decades. And one day he calls me up. I was living in New York, and he says, it's time. We're going to go see them all. And he set up literally, I was like a kid in a candy store. He set up a bunch of these meetings. And I am like, oh my God, these guys want to meet me? This is awesome. The very first meeting, by the way, it immediately becomes clear, like they're catching up with their friend Mark, and like he has a tag along. So like one, you're just like, okay, let me reset my expectations for the day. But two was, one I've talked about publicly before is we went and we saw Julian Robertson. And sitting with him for, I don't know, an hour or so, you're like, this guy is an investing legend. He has had this incredible run. I think he was 80 something years old when we saw him. And he was as sharp as anyone else I spoke with. And the number one thing I took away was how intensely curious he still was. And so he was asking question after question after question. And I was like, man, I thought this guy just wanted to talk kind of high level. This guy is in the details. He's calling an analyst, right? Asking them questions and I was like, this guy's incredible. We walked out of that meeting and we went to a different meeting with somebody who's a very well-known Wall Street investor, built $100+ billion asset management firm. Every single person knows who they are. And it was a 12-minute meeting. And 7 of the minutes or 8 of the minutes was like, Mark, how are your kids? How's your family? It's so great to see you. Oh, this is a cute idea. Why don't you guys leave some information, at the desk and we'll look at it later. And we walked out, and the takeaway from that meeting was Mark, I could tell he didn't say anything, but I could tell he was kind of bummed. He's like, man, I know this guy for, 20 years or whatever. We have this great relationship, all this stuff. Like, he kind of just was dismissive. And I remember saying to Mark, like, no, that's the opportunity, right? Is that the guys who have tons of money and who have been around for a long time and, are the legends, they don't see this yet. And so there's a window of time that we can go and we can capture value in a market before those guys show up. And so again, it comes back to kind of framing. And I don't know where that comes from. I don't know why I thought of it in that moment, but we met two legends in a span of, 2 hours, very different experiences, but we could learn from both of them. And so how much of that is from the online stuff? Like unclear. I actually think the bigger impact of the online stuff was I was prepared for both of those meetings because I had to compete in the like war of free ideas online or like the free market of ideas. And so that's actually to me been the biggest benefit is if you're inside of an academic organization, there's a lot of like, well, I'm a tenured professor. You're not. Like my say goes, right? If you're inside of the government or like the military, it's, well, look at my rank on my chest. What are you, right? What's your pay grade? On the internet, nobody gives a shit about any of that. Like you literally see, no name, a pseudonymous account attacking Elon Musk and Elon Musk firing back. Like it is no holds barred war of ideas on the internet. And so if you can survive and thrive on the internet, you are especially prepared to survive and thrive in kind of the real world where people treat things with much more kind of gloves on, and they're much more respectful. People don't want to be awkward in person, etc. And so that's probably the biggest benefit is not the people that you meet or the experiences. It's much more the preparation and the training that you get to then be able to compete with ideas in the real world.
That's so true. I mean, in the world of startups and online, like you're in contact with the real world every day. Like there's actual traction every day.
The feedback loop.
The feedback loop is tight. We were talking about like mentality shifts and vibe shifts, and that's just true in very active spaces. Your connection with reality is going to be tight by necessity of that space, by definition, versus having a giant endowment or having a giant cash flowing business that's just so enormous and monolithic that the momentum just carries it forward and you can do stupid things and it doesn't actually impact it in the near term.
It's tight and it's severe, right?
Yeah.
Like I think the speed is important because you can iterate quickly, but the severity of it really is, hard to ignore. So if you say something and everyone likes it, you go viral, right? And everyone, is liking and you're like, oh my God, I'm a genius today. The fastest way to know whether you're right or wrong is to say it on the internet, right? Because if you're wrong, you will get absolutely, slapped across the face and people will be like, you're an idiot. And you're like, by the way, yesterday you said I was a genius. Like you're the same person who told me I was smart yesterday. Now you say I'm an idiot. And they're like, yeah, because today you said dumb things. And so like come back tomorrow and try again. And so I think the severity is almost as important as the speed of the feedback loop as well.
That's a great point.
Are there any, from all the people that you've talked to, interviews, meetings, you got to add this a little bit, but any consistent blind spots that you noticed in hyper successful people?
Well, there's two things that I'll say. One is there are people who are very well known, and you have to be able to separate out like who's being themselves and who's got the character on. And so like, I've interviewed a ton of people that maybe even some people would consider controversial. And I've always been like, I don't care how anyone else views this person. I want to talk to this person. And so if you, if you look, I always like joke. I think I'm the only person in the world to have interviewed CZ, to have interviewed Sam Bankman-Fried, Michael Saylor, Andrew Tate, Liver King, right? Like we can go down the line. We just like keep adding all these people. And so you look at it and you're like, they're all loved or not loved by different groups of people. They're all very similar. And what I mean by that is like, they're incredibly ambitious people. They all have very unique views on whatever it is that they're doing. They're doing something different than everyone else. They tend, in my experience, to actually, when they take the mask off and kind of they're, just talking normal, they tend to be incredibly human in the sense of they have empathy, that they're trying to understand other people, etc. And they are master communicators. And sometimes that master communication can come off weird. Like if you watch an interview with Sam Bankman-Fried, you're like, this dude's a weirdo. Well, it worked, right? And so like at the end of the day, the result spoke more than the means. because he was able to tell this whole story and get media coverage and raise money and do all that. And so regardless of the like tactic or strategy, they all are master communicators. On blind spots, I would say that, not take those individuals aside. I would say that blind spots usually are when things become religion. Like one of the big worries that I have now when it comes to the Bitcoin maximalist crowd is it has become a hardened religion
100%.
where there are people, when they are presented with new information, they cannot change their mind because it is a moral argument. It is not a factual argument. And so when you get into that situation, it's really hard. You got to be really careful. And the best example is like, look at some of the churches, right? Like there's a lot of shit that happened and people got locked into these like moral, kind of boxes. And then they ended up doing bad shit. And then everyone's like, why'd they do that? And it's like, well, like everyone was saying one thing, but the facts in the real world were different. And so I think that there's some of that going on across all industries. I just use them as an example. And you have to balance it because sometimes being part of the religion actually is valuable, right? Like how many Bitcoiners would have sold over the last 10 years if it hadn't been for the whole like buy and hodl, never sell, like that whole thing. Like that part is actually dead on. But if you think about being like a startup founder, you have to be a risk killer. You have to understand what the risks are. You have to be honest with yourself and say, where are the areas where we could get disrupted? Where are the areas where we need to innovate? Where are the areas where we need to improve? And then let's go work on that. But if you're inside of a religion, it's kind of like rosy picture. We win, we're dominating and there is we don't need to improve anything. And so that's a very interesting balance. I think there's a lot of people in the Bitcoin community who do a great job of it. But then, of course, on the fringes, there's people who don't. If you go and you look at the public markets, it's the same thing, right? Like how many investors were just buying whatever asset because it was like everything's going up. Who cares about macro? Who cares about any of this stuff? And I'm just going to get rich. They get hammered. If you go to venture capital, same thing. How many people were, it doesn't matter the valuation when you invest to begin with. I'm going to invest in a seed company at $150 million valuation. By the way, I can say all this because guess what? I have a business that we invested in and I was recently talking to them. They're doing incredible. And we invested 2 years ago and I was catching up with the founder and I said, by the way, what's the round that we invested in? It was the first round. He was like, yeah, we raised money and it was like, I don't know, $100 million valuation or something. And I did it. I'm guilty, right? So I can mock the fact that like, yeah, even I got caught up in it to some degree.
The hype cycle.
Yeah.
Now, most of them weren't like that. But yeah, there was a couple of investments where it was just like, I don't care what the valuation is. And then you get reminded and kind of get your hand slapped, right? And you're like, hey, yeah, valuation does matter. And so I think that these blind spots can be individual specific or market condition specific. The market condition stuff is like 2021 was awesome. Like, the punch bowl was out. Everyone was drunk. Everyone was getting rich and like paper marks. Shit, might as well be cash in my bank account, right? And that's how everyone was acting.
Yeah.
That's the market stuff. On the individual side, I think a lot of it is, do you have the ability to be dexterous and mentally flexible enough to go from year to year, industry to industry, investing and operating, and be able to critically think from first principles? And that's a really, really hard skill. But the best of the best, they can do it and do it really well consistently. If you said to me, what's one of the blind spots though, that's probably it, is there's a lot of people who say, oh, I'm an expert at this, or I was really successful at this. And then they go to their next company or their next industry and they don't start off with kind of the beginner's mindset. And they end up actually, skipping some steps and getting a bad position.
Gotcha. So they're not a ball player in that sense, or they get too tied up in one specific niche.
Yeah, it's like if you expand the ball player analogy, right? It's like it's one thing to go from playing shortstop to pitcher. Like that, that's a hard transition, but like, you're still throwing a ball. It's still the same baseball. It's, generally the same mechanics. But if I then said to you like, all right, let's go play lacrosse.
Right.
Like, newsflash guys, I played a lot of sports when I was growing up. You hand me a lacrosse stick, I look like an idiot. Right. I can't catch it. I can't throw the ball. There's a ball involved, but
It's like
it's a completely different sport.
From basketball to baseball,
Correct. And so I think that, Yeah, the best people, they just have an ability to, like, what would you do? If you were a baseball player your whole life and somebody said, hey, you got to go play lacrosse, the right thing to do is start out and say, like, I know nothing. Okay, like, how do I hold the stick? Right? Like literally, like, what are the basics of this? How does the ball fit in the stick? And you just build up from there as if you were a 5-year-old. And so that's just really hard. It takes an intellectual humility to be able to have that beginner's mindset and start from scratch. That there's just people, that I've met over the years who are super successful. Like, they're used to money solving problems, right? They're used to their reputation. Just like, hey, I enter a market and I win. And so you just have to be careful. I think is probably the right approach. It's just be really, really careful that you don't fall into that trap.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I think it probably goes back to what you were saying at the beginning of, like, telling the truth from the beginning, right off the bat, always. Because if you get to a position of power, authority, or prominence by not telling the truth, there will be a moment where you have to speak. And if you're not practiced, it's gonna be weird, and you're not gonna want to do it. Whereas if you're just consistent truth teller and, like, truth seeker from the get go, when you had nothing all the way to the top, then you've been flexing that muscle, you've been exercising from the get go. So speaking kind of along those lines, I've been wanting to ask you, Pomp. You have a huge bookshelf behind you. How do you balance content creating versus, like, I don't know, content consumption, input and output? When do you, like, just in terms of, like, your week, you're a busy guy, how does reading and learning figure into your week?
So everything I do is focused on learning. All of the content creation is just the exhaust from the learning. So if you think about, the podcast, like you all and I are going to sit here and talk today, I'm going to learn a bunch of stuff. So whether I'm the guest or I am the host, I'm learning. And so, yeah, sure, we just record the conversation, but I would love to just call you guys and have the same conversation even if we weren't recording.
Right.
And so a great hack is I just record it. Right. And so that's a lot of, like, that type of creation. The writing is probably the most selfish thing I do. So every morning I write this letter to a bunch of investors, and it has 3 components in the process. The first is I have to ideate, what am I going to write about? And so I have to throw a really wide net. I go and I look at a bunch of different things that are going on in the world, and I try to formulate some high level idea as to, like, oh, this is interesting, right? And say, okay, like, here, I'm going to zero in on, this is the idea. Today I wrote about Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen saying that the citizens should be okay. Don't worry of the fact that inflation hit, because actually wages have gone up. So you're better off today than you were pre-pandemic. Like, is that true? Let's go look at some data, right? So like, okay, I selected an idea. The second part, which is highly valuable, is I then go and do a bunch of research to then have the information to write. And so all that research, like today, that doesn't seem very true. There's a lot of data points that definitely disprove that idea. And so, as I'm going through it, the deeper I go in the research, the more I'm, like, almost cultivating that information. I'm getting that up and I'm saying, okay, what are the things that support this idea and the things that disprove the idea? And then the third component is then I have to put it into a coherent story so that I can essentially teach, hundreds of thousands of other people. And there's no better way to make sure you understand the information than to teach it to somebody else. And so in a span of, anywhere between 40 minutes to an hour and a half, I basically went super deep on a topic, got a bunch of information, had to coherently understand it to be able to then articulate it back to a bunch of people who, again, I'm throwing it out there into the free market of ideas, and, like, they will kill me. I mean, I have written things before and been wrong. 100% I was wrong. I miscalculated something. I didn't think about, the third order effect of something. Just, you write every day, you're going to make mistakes or not be on your A game every single day. The emails I get back, I'm like, damn, y'all will humble me in 2 seconds. Right? And I'll go and I'll look sometimes. I'll be like, man, this guy's an asshole. And I'll look, he's opened the email every day for 4 years. Right. So, like, obviously he finds value in it, but like the one mistake and he just gets you. Right.
Yeah.
And
That's
it,
funny.
Again, forces you to be good. And so I think that's kind of content. In terms of the reading, I've told the story before, but I used to do audiobooks and, like, podcasts and audiobooks a lot. And I thought I was retaining most of the information, but then somebody handed me a physical book. I tried to read it. I couldn't concentrate and read the book. Like, I kept checking my phone and the computer and, like, all, and I was like, oh my God, like, I'm a loser in the reading department. Like I became a loser, right? Like shit. And so I made a promise to myself that I was only going to read physical books. So for almost 2 years, I only read physical books. And it was hard. Like it was very difficult to get back into reading the physical books. And I created a whole system. I would read the book. I would highlight while I was reading. When I got done reading the book, I would then transpose or transcribe the highlights into a Google Doc. I would then have all the highlights from the book in that Google Doc. I then would create notes for myself off of those highlights. So at the end of the day, I ended up reading the same information, like the best parts of the book, 4 or 5 times. I read it, then I read it when I highlighted it, I read it when I transcribed it, and then I read it when I made the notes. And so I really, really got the information. Today, I spend probably 80% of my reading on physical books, 20% I have a Kindle. And that's really like when I'm traveling. I just don't want to carry around the physical books. But that stuff to me is like, again, barbell. I think Andreessen recently said this, and I was like, yep, that's exactly how I think about it. It's like I read super immediate things like the news of the day. And then I read things that like have stood the test of time, right? Or like stories about the past. I don't spend a lot of time on the things in the middle. And so, people send me their new books and all this stuff all the time. And, I'll kind of read through them quickly to get them feedback or whatever. But really my focus is either I want to learn about things that already occurred that we know are valuable and have a high hit rate or a high batting average in terms of value, or I want to read about what is going on right this second so that I can use that to, put into my decision-making algorithm to understand where the world is going.
Mm-hmm.
What non-business book do you really like that's shaped you sort of as a business guy?
There's a ton. People always ask me for the book recommendations. I'm like, I could spend 5 hours.
Okay, let's reverse that then.
Rattling them off.
How about a book that everyone loves and you're just like, do not ever read this book. This is just dead wrong.
Well, let me answer your first question because I actually have a pretty good answer. So there's a book. It's right here above my head, that red book right there. It's called How Will You Measure Your Life by Clayton Christensen. So everyone knows Clayton Christensen because he wrote Innovator's Dilemma. But this other book he wrote, I forget all the details, but I think that he had just been diagnosed with a medical situation. And so he sat down and he wrote this book. And in it, he talks about a bunch of things you wouldn't believe are important for business, but actually are maybe the most important thing in business. And I'll give you a couple examples. He went to Harvard Business School and a couple of his classmates ended up in jail. Very successful business people, they ended up in jail. And so one of the things he talks about is like, how will you measure your life? How important is integrity? Because if you have high integrity as a person, you have high integrity when your wife's not looking, when your kids aren't looking, when your friends aren't looking, but also when the regulators aren't looking, right? It's just you're a high integrity person. Right. He talks about raising children and not outsourcing the raising of your children to other people. And so he says a lot of times what happens is people are like, oh, I'm sending my kid to this school because it's a good school. He's like, no, you're basically hiring a babysitter. Right. And like that person is going to raise your kid and you know nothing about that person. You know nothing about their values, their morals, the way that they talk to your kids, et cetera. And so it just goes through a lot of things that is focused on you as an individual and your personal life and who you are as a person, but it is highly applicable to kind of, all settings of your life. Another book that I really like is there's this book called Being Mortal.
Is that Atul Gawande?
With Atul Gawande. Yes. And he basically lays out like America's strength is the individualism that has permeated society, and how much we believe in individual rights and freedom and like the American dream and all this amazing stuff. But the cost of that pursuit is the fact that a lot of people in America die alone. They don't, at old age, it's a point of pride to not be a burden on your children, to not move back in with your family, to not have that kind of communal relationship. And so what ends up occurring is not only do they die alone, they usually die in a hospital. And in other cultures, that's very rare, or it's not as popular as in the United States. And so there's books like that, which again, like that has nothing to do necessarily with business, but I think it's just a reminder of like your personal relationships are really important and trying to be intentional about like, what is the type of life that you want to create? And what is the type of relationship you want to have with family and friends and things like that end up being pretty important.
Yeah. So then what's a book that most people would recommend, but you just cannot stand?
if I can't stand it, I haven't finished it.
Okay, there you go. That's fair.
Yeah. So like I at one point I had a point of pride where I would like finish every book, and then I'm just like wasting my, like, this sucks. This book is horrible. Like I just put one down one time, and I was like, all right, from now on, if I open a book and I start reading it, I'm gonna put it down. There's a number of there's a number of books I would say that are like older books. So I don't read a lot of fiction, and I think there's a lot of like the classics that people are like, oh, these are amazing, whatever. I just never got into them. I don't like them, whatever. I find the same thing with a lot of TV shows. That, you know, I'm not somebody who's like, I've never watched a TV show before. There are definitely certain genres or shows that, you know, I've gotten into and watched, but like, what is the one with the dragons that, Game of Thrones?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I watched 5 minutes. I was like, it's just not for me. Sorry. I know it's not popular. No offense to anyone else. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it's just like, whatever, right? Like some people are into it, some people aren't.
Mm-hmm.
And for a while they're like, you couldn't say that because people thought that was like blasphemous. Like, oh, what do you mean you're not watching, you know, Sunday night at HBO? But yeah, I just think it's like, just find the things that you enjoy. And if it's not valuable, just move on.
Yeah, totally.
Curious. So I was watching an old interview with you, late 22, with Andrew Schultz. You guys were having a good time, but they were also like razzing you a little bit about the price of Bitcoin, which was like 15, 16 at that point. What was your mentality? What was your mentality? Where were you at mentally at that time when you had been a public proponent of it and it was just like rock bottom?
So before I explain 2022, we have to go back to 2018. So I started mining Ethereum end of 2016 into 2017. I wasn't so much on like the Bitcoin and like cryptocurrency train as I was on the mining train, right? Like it was like obvious to me, like, hey, I bought this computer, I plug it in, it prints me money. Like I have a money printer. Like this is incredible, right? Yeah. I didn't understand prices, so like I mined a bunch and then I sold it. I was up a lot. I was like, I'm a genius. I think I sold the Ether at like $150. I'd been mining it at like $10, and then it went to 1,400, and I was like, I'm the biggest moron in the world, right? So like, same asset, same year, like, you know, genius to stupid, real quick, will humble you. But by the time 2018 came around, kind of mid of the year, I'd become very convinced of Bitcoin. Like now the cryptocurrency. Like I'd done a lot of work. My wife always made fun of me. At one point, I'd bought like textbooks and printed out a bunch of stuff online, like all this, and I was like studying it like I was in school. And I remember saying to her at the time, she's like, basically like, you're a nerd. And I'm like, well, you could tell every teacher I ever had, they would never believe I'm doing this because I didn't do this in school, but like, I got to figure this out. And so I had very deep conviction, like this thing is not going to go to zero. And then I started talking to a lot of people. So I started the podcast. I started, you know, doing a lot of writing. Like I was really getting in the flow of information. And I publicly wrote this thing. Bitcoin was at $6,000. I think it was August of 2020. Or I'm sorry, August of 2018. And I publicly put this out there. I said, I think Bitcoin's going to go to 3,000 before it goes back to 10,000. So it's already down 75% from 20,000 to, you know, $5,000, $6,000, whatever. And I mean, people were just like, you're an idiot, blah, 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 whatever. I went on TV and I said it, which also was kind of like, okay. And then it happened. And when it happened, I bought Bitcoin, you know, $3,200 or something like that. And then it was like, okay, like what happens now? But while that was occurring, I was going on TV and they were just skewering me. I was the whipping boy. They were just like, this guy's, we love this guy. He's so stupid. He keeps coming on here. We just yell at him about how dumb he is. And he's got a smile on his face and he's laughing and talking shit. And like, you know, this is awesome. Kevin O'Leary, right? There's this famous clip where Kevin O'Leary is yelling at me, telling me like he was calling it crypto garbage. He was forbidding me from, you know, putting so much of my net worth in Bitcoin, all this crazy stuff. And I always credit the fact that I grew up in a family of 5 boys with like, I can talk shit with the best of them, right? You grow up in that environment. And so like, I was too naive to understand you shouldn't do that on TV. So I was just firing back at, you know, O'Leary, and it made for good TV. And, you know, kind of these iconic clips over the years. So by the time we get to 22, we'd gone from 3,000 to 69,000, you know, again, genius. Like, look, it went up, you know, all these percentage points, whatever. Here comes the crash. And the crash was not only the crash of Bitcoin, but also there was a lot of companies. And so companies that we had worked with, companies that we knew the teams, all this stuff. So it wasn't just Bitcoin's price. It was like all the carnage of these companies going out of business or struggling, et cetera. And so when FTX failed, Schultz texted me and he was like, yo, you got to come back on. and there's two people, only two people. One was Scott Wapner at CNBC and the other was Andrew Schultz. And Scott Wapner, the day FTX failed, was like, Pomp, you got to come on. And I was like, look, we got to let the dust settle for a day or two to understand what the facts are before we come, before I come on. But I was prepared for Schultz because not only did I have the 2018 experience, but I had gone on with Wapner on CNBC and they had told me it was going to be a 3-minute segment. And I won't say how I knew, but I knew a minute or two before the interview, all of a sudden it wasn't going to be a friendly interview. Like he was going to push me.
Yeah.
And they left me on national television in a live interview with Scott Wapner for 22 minutes, I think it is.
Wow.
And it was not friendly. Like, I mean, to his credit, he was doing what a true journalist should do. He was asking all the hard questions. He would ask a question I would answer and he'd be like, wait, hold on. And he'd press harder, all that stuff. And if you look at it objectively, like take myself out of the situation, you got to be like, hey man, that guy's a killer. He did exactly what he's supposed to do as a journalist. He did a fantastic job. I got to say though, being on the other side of the grilling, you're like, yo man, like, damn. Yeah. 22 minutes. Right. And you don't know when it's going to end.
Right.
And so like, that was like, again, it was hard. It was tough. It was all this stuff, but it was fair, but it was still hard and tough. It was practice for when I went on Schultz. So Schultz isn't going to, be pressing me, et cetera. And so when I went on there, he really wanted to talk about all the political stuff. That was, I don't think we talked about it. Cause I was kind of like, look, that's just not my realm, whatever. But like, he understands the internet. He knows that, if you got Sam Bankman-Fried handing out cash, like, it's candy to politicians and there's a conspiracy theory that you can uncover, like that's views. Right. 100%. And so, I had a bunch of preparation, a bunch of practice for it. We had a ton of fun. And then I saw that you clipped me essentially claiming the only 2 times I come on his podcast are the tops and the bottoms.
Right.
And I think that the first time I went on was literally like close to the top. And then obviously when I went on the second time, or maybe it was the third time, whatever it was, I think it was 2 days away from the actual bottom of the market.
Yeah. And the bottom was 2 days before they released it. So I assume when you recorded it, it was like almost exactly on. Right.
We recorded it the day before they released it. So yeah, so I was one day off from when the comments. Yeah. And so maybe the flagrant podcast crowd should just become traders instead of podcasters and make more money.
That's funny.
So what on the Bitcoin front, what are you excited about this year? Maybe we can get a Schultz-like clip out of this interview as well.
No, long term, it's very obvious that Bitcoin is going to continue to be kind of an index for global liquidity. The long-term trend is that central banks are going to have to devalue their currencies, keep interest rates lower, and push liquidity into the market to kind of keep the game going. So Bitcoin will do very well. I think that there has been a surprise to the upside of how much interest there is from Wall Street with these ETFs. There is anywhere on any given day between 8 to 14x more demand than the amount of Bitcoin that is being produced by the network in a given day. And so naturally, I joke, if you went to the first 15 minutes of Economics 101 class, if there's more demand than supply, price has to go up. And so that's going to continue to happen. And then you have the halving coming. And so you actually cut that, what is right now, $46 million of Bitcoin coming in every day. You're going to cut that in half. And so that should be a tailwind for price as well. But to me, the price stuff, like I've covered it for a long time. I've talked, ad nauseum about it. But the more interesting thing is like, there's now a tool available to people where they can just save. And it takes away the gamification of the financial markets for the average American. If you look at, real wage growth since the 1970s, basically everyone's falling behind. Productivity's continue to rise. Wages aren't keeping up. The dollar's being devalued. So everything's getting more expensive. And if you look at like what percentage of the population can afford the average home based on their salary, in the 1970s to today, it's like a horrific decline in that percentage. And so, well, that's because they're saving in dollars. And 50% of Americans don't have any investments. And so they're just literally watching their wealth be devalued away. And so now if you have something where, you don't have to go put a lot of your wealth into it, but if you're able to put a little bit of savings every single week or every single month and just dollar cost average into Bitcoin and use it as the savings account, it will withstand that devaluation pressure and actually benefits from it. And so I think that that's like a really interesting new introduction for the average American in terms of financial kind of literacy and opportunity. There's just a lot of work to do to get them to understand, hey, it doesn't have to be the only asset. It's got to be one of many assets that you hold, but you got to understand this thing because it really can have a positive impact if you do it from a kind of, correct approach and understand the risks and have done all your research.
Yeah. Going back to the other side of the barbell, traditional businesses, cash flowing enterprises, how are you approaching that in terms of looking for opportunities? Are you following your interests, specific strategy? Like, how are you approaching that space?
Yeah, I think there's three things here that are really interesting. One is everyone's super excited about the wealth transfer, like all the boomers are going to give
Right.
their businesses to
Right.
someone, whatever. I'm not as actually interested in that. I've looked at a bunch of them. I've tried to buy a bunch of those businesses. What you find is that the boomers believe their businesses are worth more than they actually are worth. You find that there's horrible cultures in many of them, not all of them, but many of them. And you essentially are conducting a turnaround without having the resources in the business in terms of talent, capital, product, et cetera, to actually conduct a proper turnaround. And so you're running into a fire and you may have to overpay to have the privilege of now firefighting. And so I'm not as excited about that. What I'm more interested in is there's a business right now we're doing a transaction with. The founders are between the ages of 35 and 45. They've been running this business for 20 years. And they've just now decided to go from local to national. So they're going to make a big push. Now you're not fighting a fire. You're actually providing accelerant.
Right. You're in
and
growth
so
mode.
the momentum's in your favor. And you got young people who, they know how to work an iPhone, right? Like they understand enough. And so you're able to kind of, I think, make more progress there. So I'm interested in old businesses, not necessarily the wealth transfer, but more so just local to national. And how do you use internet skills to do that in a really effective way? The second area that I'm really interested in is businesses that have physical components where there is some sort of hidden value. And I'll give you an example. So there's this new podcast that recently came out. This guy's doing a fantastic job. It's called Rainmakers. And in it, he basically spotlights or highlights existing investors who are famous but unknown. What I mean by that is they're famous in kind of great financial circles, but they may be unknown to the general public. So the first one he does is this guy, Richard Rainwater. The second one he does is Philip Anshu. Philip Anshu, he owns the Staples Center and a bunch of these businesses and things that you would know, but a lot of people don't know Philip Anshu as an individual himself. And so what Philip realized was there's hidden value in all of these assets. I'll give you three examples. One, he would buy railroad businesses, not for the railroads and the revenue. Those were profitable businesses. They were great, but he wanted the land underneath them because he would drill for oil. And so basically he went to a different industry, but he's really acquiring land to drill for oil.
Wow.
A second one is he started buying up tons of sports teams around the world, even local small ones. And he would go to the local communities and say, hey, I want to build a new stadium. They would give him land in a downtown area. They would give him a bunch of tax breaks and things like that. And then what he would do is rather than put a bunch of equity capital down himself, he would pre-sell all the luxury suites and the boxes and all that kind of stuff. And he would use those pre-sales as the equity capital. And so he was basically able to build a stadium kind of for free, right? To a degree. And then the third one is he owned Regal Cinema at one point, which was the largest movie chain. And this was when all the movie theaters were declining. And those movie theaters had a huge problem in unit economics. So if I remember the numbers correctly, the studio got 70% of all of the ticket sales in the first 6 weeks, and then it flipped. And then the studios got 30% and the movie theaters got 70%. But what Anshu realized is, wait a second, people show up 20 minutes early to the movie theater. So I have their attention. And so he sold tons of advertising to play on the screen for those 20 minutes. Basically, he just sold commercials,
right?
And he was able to flip the unit economics and make it super advantageous for him. And so he was able to go buy all these businesses that are declining, low, valuations, all this stuff, because he had a kind of a hidden value or a new strategy to go and employ. And so I think about that. If you take those, kind of that perspective and you go look at these older businesses, a lot of times what happens is someone thinks that they're in a single business when actually they have the ability to be in multiple businesses. And, there's a business that I know of right now. It's called a master distributor. Basically, a manufacturer makes a product. The end consumer doesn't buy it on a consistent basis. And so you can almost think of these master distributors as like a battery. The manufacturer sells it to the master distributor. The master distributor just sits there in their warehouse and they wait for the end consumer to want to buy. and then they're able to give it to them, on demand when they want it, rather than wait 6 months for the manufacturer to create something. And so what ends up happening is you have a physical, location all across the country. In this case, this one has a lot. And what they find is that maybe the locations only have 70 or 80% fill rate. So you have 20 to 30% of a physical location. You're in the master distributor business. This one company that specifically I've looked at, they only do one thing. They're a master distributor for a specific type of product, but they could be a master distributor for 10 other products. So if you talk to them, they're like, we're in the X business, but really they should be like, we're a master distributor for 50 products. They already have the infrastructure. They already have the space. They already have the systems in place. They already have the technology. Now, can you simply just go and kind of backfill with these other products? So that is true across a lot of these businesses, is if you are entrepreneurial and, again, kind of a ball player, you can quickly see a lot of opportunities that come from having fresh eyes and looking for hidden value versus the people who are in the business all day. And then the third one is, I would say, intersection of kind of the new technology and these old world things. So you can imagine, as an example, there are certain businesses that most people, use an example, self-driving cars. Self-driving cars 15 years from now are probably going to be, the dominant form of transportation. How we get there, there's a lot of regulation. There's a lot of things that have to change, whatever, but like, we're probably going to get there. What else is going to change in the world if everyone's got a self-driving car that relates to the old world, right? A stupid example could be like, well, now all of a sudden, maybe you actually can build fast food places differently, because when the drive-through was created, it has to be built in a certain way because the driver sits on the left side of the vehicle. They talk to the speaker, they drive, they pay, they do all these things, right? Now, I'm not going to go buy a construction company and be like, let's build fast food, places with a different design. But that's kind of a very elementary example where you can see like that might change. And so what are the ancillary, impacts to that? And so there's some things that we're very, very bullish on that front that we think are possible. And so when you look at those things, it's like you can attack this industry from different perspectives, but it's a very specific thesis. And it's a very specific, like in real estate, they would call it like a buy box. Right. It's like, I want to know exactly what the thing is that we're looking for so that we can look at tons of these opportunities and make sure that we're checking off all of the necessary boxes. We're not just saying like, oh, this is a manufacturing business, let's just go buy it because it's manufacturing. And like, we're so arrogant to believe that like we're smarter than the people in manufacturing. When you go talk to the people in these industries, like these people are smart. They've been working at this stuff for a long time. They got a lot of industry knowledge, a lot of relationships. And so it's very difficult to displace them or to compete with them if you don't have a specific angle, moat, competitive advantage that they haven't yet already kind of incorporated.
Do you find that with these old world opportunities, are they ever surprised that you're also like the Barbell strategy, new world content creator? I mean, like if someone's building a sexy startup, they can just DM you on Twitter and be like, hey, Pomp, love your pod. Here's what I'm doing. If someone's building a old world, cash flowing, boring business, they might not even know who you are. Do you find they're kind of surprised by that context in your career, your background?
I call it the whiplash. So usually when I first talk to them, they have no clue, they never heard of me. They don't know who I am. They don't know anything about the internet, all this stuff, whatever. And then like someone, whether it's the owner or somebody on the team or like a kid or something, somebody will Google, and then they'll be like, the next conversation, they're like fawning, right? They're like so enthralled. and you're like, by the way, neither one of these is true, right? Like I don't have zero value, but I definitely don't have as value as you now think I do. Like I'm somewhere in the middle. And I do a lot of like expectation setting because you can imagine, right? If you've never seen, kind of audience and the internet and all these things, like you think it's as simple as I read on the internet one time, like The Rock posted a picture of his new drink and now he's a billionaire. Right. And so like, oh, great. Like Pomp's just going to like tweet one time and then like, we're going to be billionaires. And you're like, actually, we've looked at this franchise business and they were like, oh, you can get us franchisees. I was like, guys, if I tweet, maybe 2 or 3 people will be interested, not even sign up, like interested. And so it's like over 12 months, could we get, 100 people interested? Sure. But it is not a like magic bullet. Cause guess what? If it was, I wouldn't be doing anything else I'm doing. And I would just be like attacking this industry. And so I do think that it again, like just tell the truth, right? It works online, but it also works in person of trying to just be as transparent and upfront as you can. Not because like it makes you a good person, like whatever, right? It's more so that if you don't set the expectation and then you do a deal with someone, you've set such a high expectation that is dislodged from reality. There's no way they can be happy. Right? Like happiness is just trying to keep expectations and reality as in line as possible. And so if you're able to simply just say, hey, here's what I think will happen, and it is realistic, then you can put it in context for them. And so sure, they're still like impressed or excited or whatever, but now they don't think that like they're going to be on Good Morning America tomorrow as like the greatest entrepreneur in America, because they did a deal with us and I tweeted about them, which literally is, I bring that up because one time some guy told me that he said, yeah, by the end of this year, my goal is to be on Good Morning America. And I was like, we may need to reset the expectations here.
That's amazing. Well, one of the things that you mentioned last time we spoke early this week was that one of the kind of unexpected places where you get really good operators is journalists, and I was really curious about that. So why don't you unpack that?
Damn, you're giving up my alpha. Yeah, so.
We can cut that from the interview.
No, leave it. The best way I know how to talk about this, especially for the tech community, is Mike Moritz was a journalist. Mike Morris, one of the most well-respected venture capitalists in history, he was a Wall Street Journal reporter. He went and obviously had a storied career. And if you think about the skill set that's necessary to invest, it is a very similar skill set that's needed to evaluate whether I should write about this company or not. What are the questions I should ask? Who are the people I should talk to? What are the market conditions? What is the likelihood that they're going to be successful, et cetera? On one of them, you are betting social capital. You are putting your name on the byline, right? And you're putting it out there into the world. There's reputational damage that I guess could come from it, especially if you write a really, kind of positive piece and it ends up being a fraud or something like that. But for the most part, you're making a social bet, but the downside isn't significant. On the other side, you're betting capital. And again, you're betting somebody else's capital usually. And so again, there's similarities there in terms of the evaluation process and also the win and the loss that can come from doing it. But now what's starting to happen is because so many of these businesses are content first, those same journalists, yes, they could go become investors, but they actually can become operators because they understand the content world. They understand how to communicate. They understand how to position things. And so what you find is they may not have the operational excellence yet in terms of literally like, what do we do day to day? How do we do finance? How do we do operations? How do we do that stuff? But what they do understand is what industries are interesting or have opportunity. What are the potential solutions that are already out there? What is the thing that is missing because they've done all that work? And then they understand how to position a new company. And what I found is if you go to a journalist and you just say, hey, you write about X, like you're an expert in this industry. What do you think someone should do to solve the problem? They actually have like pretty interesting ideas, at least like the good ones do. Mm-hmm. And they have a very nuanced view of it. And so we have had success going and working with some of these people to create new companies. Usually we start content first. So we want to build the brand. We want to build an audience. We want to be able to, find revenue in doing that. But the idea is by being content first, you eventually will build a non-content business off the back end of it. And partnering with people who have that journalist background has been super successful for us. And so we think that we're going to continue to do that.
Are you mostly starting businesses from scratch with those people? Or are you going and buying businesses where you want to swap in a new operator?
Almost always we are starting from scratch. If you think about the, venture capital today, I don't want to say I'm bearish on venture capital. I think that just venture capital is going to go back to its original roots. And what I mean by that is valuations got crazy because everyone got convinced like they're going to build $1 billion company. That's not going to happen. Two is there are 50% less publicly traded companies today than there were like 20 or 30 years ago. So the number of companies that go public is smaller. The FTC and others are becoming very tight in terms of consolidation and antitrust and things like that. So it's starting to kill a lot of acquisitions, especially of bigger startups. And because capital is so available in private markets, companies are staying longer private. And so you have to question, are you actually getting paid for that illiquidity? The QQQ has compounded annually at about 13% for the last 15 years, I think. The average venture fund return during that time period has been about 17%. Mm-hmm. So there's 400 basis points or so of outperformance. But if you've been illiquid for 10, 12, 15 years, SpaceX has been illiquid for 20 years, how much do you need? Some people will say 400 basis points is enough. Others will say it's not, right? And so like, where does that come? And the reason why I say it's a return to what it used to be is if you go back and look at Sequoia's first fund, I may get some of the details not exactly correct, but generally this is right. I think they had 9 companies in the fund. 3 of the companies they incubated. Incubated meant they were close to the company. They were heavily involved in the beginning of, recruiting, what are we going to build, all this stuff. And they had outsized percentage of ownership for that same amount of money because they were incubating. Of that fund, 2 of the 3 companies that they incubated drove like 80% of the return. And so the incubation is actually what kicked off a lot of that venture capital kind of, 70-year trend that we've all benefited from. And so you now see this, like there's other venture funds that are starting to do this. Sutter Hill and Mike and those guys are doing a fantastic job. Founders Fund, right? You got Varda, you got Open Store. Like you can go through it. Like this is not a unique idea, but I do think that you are going to see more people try to become a ball player. So you see a lot of these founders who now have funds or people who had funds trying to build companies. You're going to see a lot of incubation. And really what people are all trying to get at is they're trying to get at novel returns that aren't commoditized, because venture capital is becoming more and more commoditized. And so some people do that with branding and positioning. Some people do that with, strategy. And we think that there's a huge opportunity to start businesses from scratch, get venture-like returns without having to get venture-like, sales or going public.
Right.
Yeah. And so like, I'll give you a direct example. We know of a business that started. The person who incubated the business had about 500K or so, I think they put on the balance sheet. That business ended up getting bought for about $5 million in a very short period of time, a couple of years. And they also had cash flow along the way. And so if you look at that, you're like, okay, hold on a second. They basically got more than a 10x return in, call it like 2 or 3 years. And it was like way higher probability of that happening than going and finding the next Google.
Right.
Right. Again, if you could do that over and over again with a high degree of success, like maybe that is a better way to drive returns. The challenge or the limiting factor there is how much money can you really put to work?
Right.
500K is fine. Could you do it with 50 million? A little bit harder. Right. And so like, again, you start seeing pros and cons in the different strategies. And it really comes down to, what are you optimizing for? Are you optimizing for batting average, or are you optimizing for slugging percentage? And how much capital do you want to deploy? Hedge funds are running into the same problem. There's a lot of hedge funds that over the last couple of years have been returning capital, not 100% of the capital, but they've been giving back lots of distributions because they're realizing that, the returns that they created at 2, 5, maybe $10 billion of assets are nowhere near what they can do when they have 50 billion of assets. And so size becomes this limiting factor. And so what do? You either return some of the capital and intentionally keep yourself smaller, or you have to just get your LPs comfortable with the fact that you're not going to put up, 20% returns. You're going to put up 12% returns, but you're going to do it on 50 billion instead of 5 billion.
Yeah, no, that all seems right. I think that's right. And we feel something similar here in New Found. I mean, with our venture fund, it's just one bet of many. It's one lever of various. It's cleaner slate than sure, some of these enormous players in the market, but you can play leaner, play it smarter, and it's just a different. Like you said, going back to its back to its in some ways venture. I see it going back to like private equity, cash flowing businesses, as opposed to just like, when can I exit this big machine and move on to the next?
Yeah. Well, I've really liked the barbell framing too, of like the cutting edge and then old world. And then in between you have this, this world of like SaaS and email jobs that we've been living in for the last 10 years that is more in danger. Good.
Yeah. Look, my thought process is people will make money there for sure, right? It's not like it's a zero, but I do think that it is going to be much harder than people realize, and the returns will be lower than people realize. So you got like both forces working against you. And so like either like go for the grand slams, like don't go for doubles, right? Like go for grand slams or go for singles.
Right.
But like everything in between is just like too difficult. And the return, even if you're successful, is not high enough for the difficulty.
Totally. Dude, this was great. Where can people find you, sign up for that newsletter that you write? Where can they go?
If people just go to Twitter, it's all there. So just at a Pompliano on Twitter is probably the best place.
Awesome. Pomp, thanks so much for coming on, man. This was great.
I appreciate both of you guys. I'm a big fan of the podcast, and I'm excited I got a chance to come on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Founding Podcast. New Founding has become a rallying point for founders and investors who are taking serious bets in the face of a stagnant business culture. Our venture fund backs founders building dynamic companies, powered by American ideals and a positive national vision. These are the kinds of founders that embody the optimism and competence of the people who come on this podcast. If you're interested in investing in our fund, check out newfounding.com/venture fund and follow the link to apply.